Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are going well beyond a simple historical timeline. We're aiming to get into something much more, more visceral. We're talking about the terrifying, almost impossible challenge of creating a state from scratch under conditions of absolute chaos.
Exactly. We talk a lot about historical turning points, but we rarely dig into the immediate, brutal aftermath of one of those geopolitical shifts.
And that's our focus today, August 1947, a month that was supposed to represent freedom, sovereignty for the new nation of Pakistan.
But instead, what it delivered was arguably the greatest logistical and humanitarian nightmare in modern history. Our sources, they don't paint a picture of celebration, not at all. They describe a period dominated by the roar of trains carrying human pain.
That imagery it sets the scene perfectly, doesn't it? We're talking about building a state under the most impossible stress imaginable.
We are. And for this deep dive, we're leaning very heavily on the work of Zaheer Ahmad Meer, specifically his scholarly work, Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan.
Because Meer's analysis of Muhammad Ali Jinnah is so critical here. He doesn't just look at him as the political leader who, demanded the state.
No, he positions him as the foundational nation builder, the man who had to guide its survival, really, through sheer force of will, through law, ethics, and a very clear, almost ruthless vision for governance.
So that's our mission today. We want to understand how the foundations of a sovereign nation were laid when the state had quite literally nothing.
Nothing. No central infrastructure, no established finances, and a population that was in constant, desperate motion. We need to unpack the specific institutional and moral requirements that allowed this unprecedented act of creation to succeed against all material odds.
And when we talk about the scale of the challenge, the numbers are just staggering. They stop being statistics and they become really existential threats. So imagine this reality for a moment.
It's hard to even get your head around it.
Nearly 10 million people were uprooted. They were caught in the largest, most violent migration in human history. That is the operating environment.
And at the exact same time, the governmental reality was zero. We are talking about a state that, on paper, was sovereign, but in practice, it had no central bank, no proper secretariat, and no currency of its own that could stabilize the economy.
It's not just disorganization, is it? It's a complete functional void, an absence of everything, and it demanded immediate, impossible solutions.
That's it. It's the ultimate paradox. You finally achieve sovereignty, but that very first moment is defined by a vacuum of administration, of resources, of everything.
So let's really dive into that context. Let's call it the magnitude of zero, because that vacuum, that nothingness, it fundamentally shapes every single decision that follows.
It does. It dictates everything.
The aftermath of independence, it demands a level of historical empathy that I think we rarely exercise. The state was, barely days old?
Days old, facing utter chaos.
We have to move past this abstract idea of independence and focus on the cold, hard functionality. Or, in this case, the lack of it. Everything, and I mean everything, from the ability to pay a policeman's salary to stabilizing the economy, it all had to be built from scratch.
And we have to analyze what from scratch really means in the context of a modern state. We're so used to stable systems, where files exist, where salaries are paid through predictable mechanisms, where communication lines are actually intact.
Right, the machinery is just there.
Exactly. But in 1947, that institutional void was absolute. The administrative machinery that had existed under the British, it was either physically left across the border in Delhi or completely paralyzed by the sheer chaos of the population transfer.
So let's start with the economic paralysis. The sources really emphasize this lack of a central bank. What did that actually mean for this newborn economy that was trying to cope with 10 million hungry, displaced people?
It meant total paralysis, right down to the most basic level of governance. You have zero economic sovereignty.
So a central bank isn't just an office building with a vault.
Not at all. It's the engine of a nation's economic life. Without one, you couldn't issue your own legal tender, which meant, think about this, you had to rely entirely on these complex, politically fraught agreements with the central bank that was still in India, just to manage a shared currency.
So let's make that practical. If the new government in Karachi wanted to, say, immediately purchase massive stockpiles of grain or blankets for the refugee camps,
Right.
they couldn't just do it.
They couldn't independently mobilize the capital, precisely.
Yeah.
They couldn't raise debt on their own terms, they couldn't confidently manage inflation, and they couldn't access or even guarantee their own share of the former colonial reserves without these prolonged, painful negotiations.
And what about the people working for the new state? The civil servants.
Think about them. If you cannot guarantee that their salary will be paid, or even that the money they receive will hold its value, their loyalty, and their ability to function just, it erodes almost immediately. The lack of a central bank turned the entire country into a massive, cash flow dependent organization that was operating without its own independent checking account.
And it must have just compounded the misery for the displaced population, right? The sheer number of transactions required, pension funds, compensation for lost property, transferring private assets, all of that just grinds to a halt.
It stalls indefinitely. It
Yeah.
added economic despair to the physical suffering. The central bank is supposed to be the trusted, neutral intermediary for all those cross-border financial settlements. Without it, every negotiation over shared assets, the movement of private wealth, securing pension payments for people who'd served the previous administration, it all became impossibly complicated.
The state was fiscally invisible.
Unable to settle accounts for its own people. That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, so that's the fiscal control. What about the ability to actually govern, to maintain law and order, to coordinate relief? The sources point to the absence of a proper secretariat. What does that void look like on the ground?
The Secretariat is the central nervous system of a government. It's where the institutional memory lives.
The files, the
The
budgets?
personnel records, the established chains of command, all of that administrative continuity was either missing, physically destroyed, or literally trapped in Delhi. So lacking a secretariat meant they had no centralized governing mechanism.
So could you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine trying to coordinate the deployment of medical supplies to Punjab and Sindh. You have no idea who is responsible for logistics, what budget has been allocated, or even which civil servants are still loyal and available in those areas.
So every single communication, every decision had to be treated as a brand new, bespoke policy exercise. There were no reference points.
Correct. And the paralysis was immediate. Take the railway system. It was absolutely vital for moving refugees and supplies, but it relies on centralized coordination timetables, personnel management, maintenance schedules.
And if those records are gone,
Or the coordinating staff just don't show up because they're on the other side of the border, the critical infrastructure that you desperately need to handle the crisis just jams. The ability to transition from a conceptual nation to a functional state was paralyzed by this institutional vacuum.
it's a staggering picture of just insurmountable odds. It wasn't just a leadership challenge, it was an existential one where the actual machinery of governance was literally stripped away.
And this context is what gives so much weight to the leadership response. The analysis from Meer, it provides this defining quote, this real pivot point. He writes, "This was the moment when leadership and humanity merged. Jinnah was no longer only the maker of a state. He became the guardian of its wounded soul."
That phrase, guardian of its wounded soul, that perfectly captures the necessary shift, doesn't it?
It does. Jinnah, the constitutional lawyer, the political strategist, suddenly had to transform into the chief humanitarian officer and, so critically, the moral anchor for millions of people.
The state he had just achieved was now defined not by political triumph, but by this massive human tragedy.
And the leadership imperative meant that survival wasn't just about political stability anymore. It was about preventing the complete psychological and moral collapse of the entire populace.
It's the ultimate test of character. How do you enforce a kind of functional morality when your institutions are non-existent and the crisis is defined by brutality? So how did this guardian of the wounded soul respond when the crisis hit its absolute peak?
He responded by enforcing direct intervention from the highest possible level, and he demanded an immediate, almost spiritual rigor from everyone involved. He understood that without a powerful moral framework, the chaos would devolve into total lawlessness and the state would eat itself alive.
Okay, let's try to grasp that scale again. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people arriving every day. They're homeless, they're hungry, and they've often witnessed or endured horrific violence.
It's hard to visualize. We hear the statistics, but the sources paint this picture of trains arriving, not carrying baggage, but just carrying shattered lives.
So how do you, as a new government with no resources, no money, no coordinated administration, how do you even begin to address that volume of human need?
The very first step, as Meer documents so carefully, was a commitment of presence and priority right from the top. Jinnah was already managing these incredibly delicate political and constitutional negotiations.
And his own health was failing.
Exactly. He had his own well-known fragile health, yet he made visiting the refugee camps a high priority. And this was not just some symbolic gesture for the cameras, it was a functional necessity.
How does the leader's personal presence become a functional necessity? What does that do?
Well, when your bureaucracy is absent, the only thing that can hold the line is authority and credibility. By being physically present in those camps, Jinnah demonstrated two things immediately. One, that the suffering of the citizens was the state's absolute first priority.
Okay.
And two, he got direct, unfiltered reports from the ground. He could bypass the non-existent administrative machinery and issue orders directly to the few civil servants and military personnel who were trying to manage the camps. His personal commitment immediately shifted the focus from abstract politics to tangible human survival.
And his focus, crucially, wasn't just on ad hoc relief. It was about establishing order and compassion. It was the lawyer's mind imposing structure on the chaos, urging organization over panic.
Absolutely. Chaos breeds despair, and despair leads to crime, corruption, and administrative paralysis. He had to systematize the response instantly. The immediate institutional mechanisms were rudimentary, but they were vital. First, the formation of the Refugee Rehabilitation Committee.
The central point of contact.
It centralized the response. Even if it lacked funding, it provided a single point of authority for coordination. It moved the relief efforts out of purely disparate, chaotic volunteerism and into a semi-official national structure.
And the mandate he gave to the few civil servants they had managed to retain.
Yeah.
It was extraordinary. He told them to treat service as worship.
Which moves far beyond a standard employment requirement, doesn't it?
It transforms administrative duty into a profound moral requirement.
It does. Because when the state has no material incentive to offer, no money, no proper offices, no guaranteed future, the motivation for that kind of extraordinary service has to be rooted in conviction. By linking service to worship, he mandated absolute integrity, selflessness, and dedication. He was mobilizing a corps of officers who understood they weren't just clocking in, they were participating in a mission essential to the nation's very soul.
So this moral injunction was really the only tool he had available to drive that tireless work with such minimal support.
It was. And that moral rigor was then extended to the populace itself through the mobilization of youth volunteers. This seems like a critical step in turning that widespread despair into collective action.
So instead of letting people become victims, you make them part of the solution.
Exactly. The state couldn't physically manage the logistics, so it mobilized the energy and idealism of its youth. By engaging them in the relief efforts, Jinnah channeled the nation's passion away from post-partition violence and toward constructive survival. It created a sense of national purpose and shared responsibility that helped fill that massive vacuum left by the collapse of the British administrative structure.
This whole philosophy is just beautifully underpinned by his famous statement, the quote that serves as a kind of core moral document for the new state. You may belong to any religion or caste that has nothing to do with the business of the state.
And on the surface, it's a powerful statement of inclusion, right?
Of course. But the sources argue it was more than just tolerance. It was a functional requirement for survival.
It was a moral requirement for the state's continued existence. Let's really analyze the context. The state was born from a movement that demanded a homeland for Muslims, yet it instantly inherited a population comprised of diverse religious and ethnic minorities, and it was defined by the trauma of religious conflict.
So Jinnah was essentially saying, the crisis is universal, so the response has to be universally impartial.
Precisely. If the government's nascent machinery was perceived to distribute aid or protection based on the religion or background of the person receiving it, the whole operation would instantly collapse into internal conflict and mutual suspicion.
So it was a functional mandate for institutional impartiality.
Yes. If aid, security, or resettlement was seen as biased, the population would lose trust in the very idea of this new state. Jinnah used this quote to establish that the bureaucracy, the few civil servants they had to operate under a strict, impartial law. It functionalized diversity under the umbrella of a shared national duty.
And that created the necessary conditions for massive numbers of people to be processed efficiently, without devolving into sectarian chaos inside the camps themselves.
It did. And that level of impartial administration, in a moment defined by religious violence, is just astounding.
It speaks to the rigorous legal and ethical discipline Jinnah brought to the project. He knew the state could not survive a humanitarian crisis if it was compounded by internal, state-sanctioned division.
And this all leads us to the indispensable role of civil society. Since the state couldn't function, Ordinary citizens had to fill that monumental gap.
The mobilization of civil society was the true holding structure of those first few months.
It really was. Aid poured in from the public. But more importantly, ordinary structures were immediately repurposed. Mosques, schools, even private homes became temporary shelters and hospitals.
So the source is clear. It was the collective moral fabric, the compassion and sense of responsibility instilled by the leader's moral mandate that prevented a total systemic collapse, far more than any material wealth or existing infrastructure.
And so, with the sheer weight of the humanitarian crisis being temporarily managed by this moral will and citizen action, Jinnah had to perform this extraordinary simultaneous pivot.
Right. He had to build the foundational architecture of the state itself at the same time.
It's incredible.
It truly defies logic that one person could maintain oversight of the daily humanitarian nightmare while also constructing the fundamental governing architecture. This incredible dual focus, survive today but build for tomorrow, is the defining feature of that first year.
That simultaneous execution is key. You've got political demands and humanitarian needs just screaming for immediate attention. But Jinnah understood that immediate attention was useless unless you created institutions to sustain the results.
Because the state wouldn't survive its first anniversary without a functional framework, no matter how many lives were saved in the short term.
Exactly. So he prioritized foundational strength, and he started with economic autonomy.
Let's detail that economic step, because it was so crucial. The establishment of the State Bank of Pakistan in July 1948. That's less than a year after independence. Why was this, above all other potential institutional creations, the foundational bedrock?
It was the formal public declaration of economic independence and solvency. Until this bank was operational, Pakistan's economic existence was, well, it was theoretical. It was completely dependent on those protracted and, frankly, hostile negotiations over assets with India.
So by establishing the state bank, the new nation asserted control.
Control over its own monetary policy, its ability to issue debt, and most visibly to the world and its own people, its ability to issue its own currency.
Was the launch of the state bank merely symbolic, or did it immediately take on critical functional tasks?
Oh, it was intensely functional from day one. The bank immediately began structuring the rudimentary banking sector needed to finance the massive refugee rehabilitation efforts. It had to create mechanisms for capital flow where none existed. And it provided the necessary credibility for international trade to even begin, however slowly.
And Jinnah himself inaugurated it.
He insisted on it, marking it as a monumental achievement. It was a declaration that they had moved past total fiscal dependency and acquired the toolset for financial survival. It provided the necessary backbone to manage the finances of survival, moving the state from just a geographical entity to a sovereign fiscal actor.
That timing, July 1948, it just underscores the urgency. They literally spent the entire first year trying to create this financial anchor. What other critical institutional pillars were being erected at the same time?
They moved on all fronts that constituted national security and basic administration. The civil service was a crucial focus, emphasizing integrity and professionalism, as we discussed. They needed administrators who were loyal and capable of working in this new structure.
And what about defense? Law and order were collapsing due to the migration chaos and the associated violence.
Absolutely essential. There was the immediate, painful process of reorganizing the armed forces, a massive undertaking involving the splitting of personnel, assets, and command structures, all while actively dealing with border security crises and internal displacement issues.
So the military had to transition from a colonial force to a national one.
And it had to be capable of defense and aiding civil power. Often, the military was the only disciplined administrative body in overwhelmed areas.
And alongside the money and the defense, there was the abstract idea of law. They started framing guidelines for a future constitution.
Right. Even though the actual constitution would take years to write, Jinnah immediately set the ideological and legal framework for it. He needed to ensure that the necessary legal and political boundaries were being planned from the outset.
Which signaled to the global community and to his own people that this was a state founded on constitutional principles, not just emergency decree or military rule.
That's right. And the source suggests there was this unifying functional mantra that was delivered to all these new bodies: discipline, duty, devotion.
It sounds almost military.
It had to be. It had to have that rigor. Discipline was essential to impose order on institutional anarchy. Duty guaranteed relentless commitment despite having minimal resources. And devotion was the higher ideal connecting their work back to the existential survival of the nation. These were operational imperatives because the state was literally running on conviction, not on comfort or administrative stability.
This brings us to that fascinating insight from Meer, that these institutions were not born out of luxury. They were born out of necessity and sustained by conviction. Can we elaborate on that? The profound difference between institutions built for comfort versus those built for survival.
It's a crucial distinction. Institutions that are built in stable, wealthy environments often suffer from, inertia, layers of bureaucracy. They might primarily serve established interests. They can afford to be inefficient.
But institutions born of necessity, like the state bank in 1948, they have no margin for error.
Zero margin. They have to be relentlessly efficient and purely focused on public function. The Refugee Rehabilitation Committee, for example, couldn't afford a slow, bureaucratic process. People were starving today. Institutions built for survival are inherently more transparent and meritocratic because failure means catastrophic national collapse.
So the crucible of the crisis itself forced immediate excellence and ethical conduct.
Yes, because only results visible to a suffering public could justify their existence and maintain any kind of trust.
So the very dire circumstances became a kind of self-correcting mechanism against internal weakness. They had no time for corruption or inefficiency. The lives of 10 million people depended on them moving fast and acting ethically.
And that conviction sustained them. The belief that the state must succeed for the people who had suffered to create it provided the relentless energy required to staff and run these nascent institutions, often with meager resources and in dilapidated temporary facilities.
So if necessity forced the creation, what philosophy guided the integrity of these urgently built institutions? How did Jinnah ensure that this speed and urgency didn't sacrifice the fundamental moral principles he'd already laid out?
That's the core question, isn't it? And it takes us from the logistical to the philosophical.
Right. We transition now to Jinnah's overarching vision, which was clearly a moral state built on law, merit, and justice. In a historical moment where the vacuum of power could have so easily led to warlords and self-interested elites taking over, this mandate for a moral state was incredibly risky, but also necessary.
It was an immediate ethical declaration. In that vacuum of 1947, the opportunities for immediate self-enrichment, for black market profiteering, for the abuse of newly acquired power, they were immense. Jinnah understood that if the new bureaucracy started with corruption, the state would be fatally compromised before it was even out of its infancy.
So he had to define the ethical boundaries of state power instantly and emphatically.
He did. He issued these stringent warnings to the new bureaucracy gathering in Karachi. The absolute core of his anti-corruption mandate was simple but revolutionary in context. Remember, you are servants of the people.
He was drawing a thick, uncrossable line between the exploitative ruling elites of the past and the public servants of this new nation.
Yes, and he specifically targeted what he called nepotism, corruption, and jobbery, the insidious use of public office for personal or family gain. He recognized that these vices were the fastest way to erode public faith and paralyze the already fragile administrative structure.
The source links this desire for ethical governance directly to faith. It states that Jinnah believed administrative purity was the spirit of Islamic governance. This suggests he wasn't just relying on secular law, but on a spiritual imperative.
This fusion of faith and functionality is a critical analytical point. Jinnah, who was a highly westernized, secular-minded lawyer, was operationalizing ethical governance by anchoring it to a profound spiritual obligation that was common among his civil servants.
So he was essentially telling them, it's not enough to simply follow the British administrative law we inherited. You must function with a higher immutable moral conviction.
Exactly. If officials viewed their adherence to duty as a spiritual exercise, the temptation of corruption would theoretically be reduced because the consequence was greater than just being dismissed from your job.
And the mechanism for this linkage is explored through the concept of amana, or trust. Let's really analyze how Jinnah connected modern bureaucratic accountability with this Quranic ideal.
Amana is a powerful concept. It transcends the simple Western notions of public trust. It signifies a sacred, divinely witnessed trust placed upon those in power. Jinnah utilized this ideal to instill the sense that holding a government office was not a privilege to be exploited, but a heavy, almost sacred burden of responsibility.
So if modern accountability focuses on, say, measurable results, audits, and legal compliance, The addition of Amana adds that essential layer of spiritual compliance.
It does. It transforms the failure to perform your duty, or the act of corruption, into a breach of a moral contract with the entire community and with God.
Which shifts accountability from a bureaucratic chore to a fundamental moral duty.
Precisely. For instance, when you're dealing with the allocation of abandoned properties or land for refugee resettlement, an area that is just ripe for corruption, invoking Amana provided a moral scaffold. It demanded that those in charge ensure their actions serve the public good and the dispossessed, not their personal networks. It created a conscience-based rulebook before the bureaucratic rulebook was even fully written.
Did this concept face any friction among the bureaucracy? I'm thinking particularly of those who were educated in the strictly secular tradition of the British colonial civil service.
It created a unique administrative tension. The technically trained secular bureaucracy needed measurable processes. Jinnah's response, as Meer notes, was that the moral rigor was the measurable process in that initial vacuum. You couldn't audit every single cash transaction in the chaos of 1947, but you could appeal to the deepest moral conviction of the administrator.
So he prioritized creating a highly motivated, high-integrity core of officers, arguing that moral purification was the prerequisite for successful administrative function.
It was about building the moral compass first, and that allowed the state to move with speed without collapsing into decay.
That distinction, using a spiritual ideal to enforce secular impartial functioning, is what allowed the state to move so quickly. They had established the rulebook of conscience before they finished writing the formal constitution.
And this adherence to meritocracy rooted in Amana was crucial for long-term state stability. He demanded that appointments be based purely on ability, rejecting communal or family ties. This allowed the recruitment of the few talented individuals available, regardless of their origin, ensuring that the vital, urgently built institutions had the most competent people running them.
So when we synthesize the logistical paralysis of August 1947 with the sheer scale of the humanitarian demand and the speed of the institutional building, the rate of accomplishment in that first year is, frankly, stunning. Let's just summarize what was achieved between independence and mid-1948.
It was a testament to organized will. In those 12 months, while they were still managing the bulk of the refugee crisis, the administration created functioning ministries. Ministries of Finance, Defense, Interior. They established clear chains of command, staffed often by officers who had to work out of tents or hastily clean barracks.
And a fully functional banking system.
A fully functional banking system with the inauguration of the state bank.
And those are just the high-level structures.
Yeah.
What about the immediate functional requirements for daily life to even resume?
Well, they reorganized the Defense Command, which was critical for maintaining sovereignty and internal security. They managed to restore and launch a national postal network, a vital logistical tool for connecting the disparate parts of the new state, essential for administrative communication.
And the national press.
And they launched the national press to communicate government policy and, perhaps most importantly, to maintain national morale. These are not minor administrative adjustments. These are the fundamental components required for any modern nation to exist, executed under extreme duress.
And the institutional progress had a direct, measurable impact on the human condition. The sources connect the institutional progress right back to the refugee crisis.
This is the most profound outcome. The moral will, combined with this new institutional capacity, meant genuine humanitarian transformation. The chaotic, disease-ridden refugee camps that dominated the landscape of 1947 slowly began to yield to order in 1948.
So where major encampments once stood.
Hospitals began to rise. Refugee children were transitioned into schools that were reopened and integrated into the public system, ensuring their futures weren't completely derailed by the trauma of migration.
So the functional institutions transitioned the collective compassion of civil society into sustainable, state-sponsored care. It transforms the symbolic into the functional.
Beautifully put. The flag, which was a desperate symbol of hope and aspiration in August 1947, now flew over working institutions. It was no longer just a piece of cloth. It was a physical representation of an administrative reality that managed currency, ran trains, and educated children. The creation was complete. The state was now enduring.
And this endurance, according to Zaheer Ahmad Meer, became the ultimate measure of their success. Let's reflect on that final analysis from the source. A nation is tested not in moments of triumph, but in moments of trial.
And Pakistan's first year was its defining test, a test that it passed through faith, discipline, and sacrifice.
It is the ultimate vindication of Jinnah's governance philosophy. The state survived not because it had wealth or infrastructure,
It had neither.
but because it prioritized moral integrity,
Hmm.
ama, and radical administrative efficiency, discipline, duty, devotion. The crisis did not destroy the state. It forced the leadership to build its institutional roots faster and deeper than any peaceful transition would have allowed.
The sheer amount of sacrifice from the population and the rigorous dedication of the civil service proved that the commitment to the national ideal was stronger than the logistical impossibility of the situation.
So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, to summarize the key insights for you, the listener, I think the story of Pakistan's birth offers two vital lessons on leadership and state creation. First, true leadership isn't discovered. It's forged in moments of existential chaos. Jinnah's transition from political strategist to the guardian of the wounded soul demonstrates that in such an environment, a leader has to instantly pivot to become the state's functional and moral anchor.
And second, foundational institutions absolutely must be built on moral rigor to survive necessity. The insistence on amana and administrative purity wasn't some philosophical flourish. It was the prerequisite for survival when material resources were zero. The state had to be ethically sound before it could ever hope to become financially stable.
It proves that the character of the institutions matters more than their initial resources. The rapid formation of structures like the State Bank of Pakistan under such constraints. It highlights that political will, when it's driven by moral clarity, can overcome almost impossible logistical barriers.
From ruins, Pakistan built roots. From chaos, it created character. The sheer scale of that first year's achievement, regardless of the immense ongoing struggles that followed, it remains a profound testament to human will and organizational discipline.
The journey, as the source notes, had only begun. But the character of the state had been defined in that trial by fire.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought.
It does. Something for you to consider. If institutions are born primarily of necessity, as these structures were, does that make them inherently stronger and more resilient, more focused on service than those established during times of peace and luxury? What does necessity truly teach a nation about its absolute priorities and the critical, non-negotiable role of duty and sacrifice? It suggests that perhaps the greatest test of any system is not how well it performs when resources are abundant, but how effectively it functions when resources are zero.